International news now.
So we're going to start today's discussion of the news with North Korea and some of the repercussions that emerged from President Trump's speech and some of the subsequent exchanges that he had with North Korea's political leadership. And in his speech at the United Nations last week, Trump escalated the rhetoric toward North Korea in two ways. He personalized it, right? He personalized this exchange by using what was interpreted as sort of demeaning nicknames like Rocket Man to refer to North Korean President Kim Jong-un. But he also made additional threats in reaction to the threats that were made by North Korea. So Trump's personal attacks evoked a strong response from North Korea, but it also raised some concerns among commentators and allies who feared that his approach could lead to some misunderstanding and miscalculation on the North Korean side. And so we're going to start this conversation here with a clip from the PBS NewsHour that captures the essence first of the exchanges between President Trump and the North Korean leadership. So let's go ahead and play that clip.
Tit for tat continued at the United Nations General Assembly.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
It's an absurd reality. A person like Trump, a mentally deranged person full of megalomania and complacency, holds the nuclear button.
Over the weekend, President Trump tweeted that if North Korean officials repeated specific threats, they won't be around much longer. And the North Korean foreign minister responded,
Since the United States declared war on our country, we have every right to take countermeasures, including shooting down the United States strategic bombers. The question of who will be around much longer will be answered then.
Today, President Trump repeated his threats and said Kim Jong-un started it.
He's saying things that should never, ever be said, and we're replying to those things, but it's a reply. It's not an original statement, it's a reply.
So the rhetoric used by Donald Trump is a sharp break with prior administrations, which have avoided these types of harsh and personal exchanges. Both President Obama and President Bush criticized North Korea's leaders, but did so less directly and publicly. Now, it's uncertain whether this new rhetoric is strategic or not, and what effects it might have. And so to get a little further into this debate, we're going to run another clip to get two somewhat different views on Trump's approach to North Korea.
And Ambassador, to that point, I mean, could these threats be effective where, frankly, a lot of the diplomacy in the past was not?
I don't think the threats are effective, and I think as the discussion before we started this talk demonstrated, the problem with threats is, and certainly red lines, is if you draw red lines, and it's not just the Trump administration that's seen this, but others, and then the North Koreans cross it, what happens? It is a problem of credibility. It's a problem, and I think there's a big problem if the words of our president are not taken seriously. It really reduces our ability to influence and shape events. That said, I do agree with Balbina that my own assessment, and there may be some hopeful thinking in this, is that neither side wants a war. I'm worried about the inadvertent miscalculation that can happen in what is a highly militarized environment, one in which President Trump, for the first time, and even putting aside the kind of childish ad hominem attacks on each other, but where he has strayed, he has demonstrated no awareness of the kind of traditional kind of clarity of deterrence, how we deter each other, how we signal intentions. I don't think that uncertainty is a good thing. No one, perhaps President himself, knows, is he really talking when he talks about a response the world has never seen before? Is he talking about a nuclear response or not? We don't know. Yes, I think that gives Pyongyang pause, but that doesn't give me any comfort, because I think it also, as I mentioned, says to Kim Jong-un, he says, well, I was right to try to develop my own nuclear deterrent. I think the challenge now is to find a way to go forward and deter each other.
Quickly, Professor Wong, I mean, giving Kim Jong-un pause, isn't that part of the point?
That's exactly right. And in fact, uncertainty, while it does make us anxious, uncertainty is what drives North Korea's insecurity. And I think in this case, insecurity is what's going to push North Korea back to the negotiating table, if anything it does.
So, as this clip explains, there are some potential dilemmas here associated with making this conflict between countries a personal battle between individual leaders. And the first dilemma is the risk of miscalculation. Kim Jong-un took the unusual step of making a direct statement in his name on national television. In North Korea, the supreme leader's statement carries a weight that surpasses any other formal document. But another problem with Trump's approach is credibility, and his threats to totally destroy North Korea and comments that North Korean leadership may not be around much longer raise the stakes in the conflict. They escalate it. This heightened rhetoric may paint each side into a corner that will be hard to get out of and make de-escalation more difficult and future diplomacy more difficult as well. Now, on the other hand, Trump's novel approach raises the uncertainty and insecurity of North Korea and may make the country's leaders more cautious.
So, I mean, what do you make of this? I mean, it's, you know, I've been reading a lot of this, and the debate on PBS sort of covered this in clips that weren't shown. But, you know, one of the points that the commentator who sort of defended his approach in this more bellicose language was that, you know, we tried the high road. President Obama was kind of famously strategically patient, kind of silent and ignoring the North Korean leadership, and that didn't get our desired results. It didn't deter North Korea at all. And so perhaps, as she hinted at, that this different approach that raises the stakes and sort of tries to match belligerents with belligerents from our side is precisely the thing that is needed to shake things up and change course here. You know, there's a lot of risks to that. I think, you know, one thing about the goals here is that there's a goal, of course, to get them to stop testing nuclear weapons and to stop developing a nuclear program. But there's also a goal to avoid a military exchange, and that goal over numerous administrations has been met. We haven't had a military exchange in the Korean Peninsula, and you only take that for granted because it didn't happen. But if it did, that would be catastrophic.
I mean, so a couple points here. And the first thing to realize on this comment on is this helping by escalating the rhetoric? Remember that to get out of this situation, one side has to compromise. One side has to concede. One side has to step away from the escalating crisis. Now, by personalizing it, by making threats of destruction on both sides, it's making it harder for both sides politically to make concessions at home. So the escalation of rhetoric can complicate, in that sense, reaching a peaceful resolution, because at some point someone's going to have to give a little here. But by making outlandish claims, it makes it harder for one side to stand down. Second thing I want to point out here is there was a story, I think it was in the Post this week, about how North Korea, and this goes right to one of the arguments that was made in the clip, or the purposes of this escalation, is North Korea is confused. So they are uncertain about what the United States is doing. How do we know that they're confused? The North Korean government reached out to a series of American experts on security policy on the Korean Peninsula over the last week or two, looking for insights about the Trump administration. I think all of these people declined and said, we're not going to talk to you, you need to speak with the U.S. government. In part, they don't want to undermine any message that might be coming out of the State Department or under the White House. But the larger point was that this was unique in a sense that North Korea was actively seeking help from Americans to try to figure out what President Trump was trying to do in the conflict. So yes, they are uncertain. Now, the question here is, what we think that uncertainty will do to the larger situation, right? And you see this disagreement. One scholar says uncertainty is good, it's going to make them more cautious. Another one says uncertainty is bad because it can increase the risk of miscalculation in a crisis like this. In a sense, they both get painted into a corner where they can't back out of, they can't concede, right? And so this is one of the challenges for President Trump right now, is given the escalation in rhetoric, is what happens if a deal gets put on the table, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, which is one that suggests the U.S. makes a public commitment not to support regime change in North Korea, and for that, North Korea will give up its nuclear weapons program, let the inspectors in. How can President Trump agree to that concession, which would be a huge concession, right? We're going to just let Kim Jong-un, a dictator, a harsh dictator, remain in power, right? It's difficult, given the rhetoric and given the promises and the threats that he's made, to then stand down and make those concessions. And we can see these challenges in the context of the Iranian nuclear accord. Right? At the end of the day, the United States made significant concessions there. Iran can still get nuclear weapons after this accord is over after 10 years. This exposed the Democratic Party and President Obama to political weakness, right? You're being soft on Iran, we have to get tougher, we can't deal with rogue regimes. President Trump will face the same set of challenges if he makes any set of concessions to Kim Jong-un to try and tamp things down. The other thing I want to say about all this is, will the rhetoric work? Is it effective? There's an extensive literature on crisis diplomacy in international relations that suggests that these threats are really only effective when they're costly to make. And they're costly to make when a leader can suffer punishments for not following through on these threats. So we don't believe Kim Jong-un's threats because he's a dictator. The public can't revolt against him because it's a tight police state. So what he's saying when he makes these threats against the United States, this is cheap talk. Because he can't be punished for not following through on those threats to, say, wipe out the White House. Alternatively, things are different in a democracy because we have regular elections, because party leaders are subjected to constraints and punishment by members of their party. So in this sense, there is more opportunity for the American public to punish President Trump for not following through on his threats, for not cutting a deal here. As a consequence, that should help make his threats, his attempts at diplomacy with North Korea more effective, because North Korean leaders should say, he's not just blustering here, he's exposing himself to real domestic criticism. The challenge is he? And what's unique about President Trump's situation is, and this goes back to the poll numbers that we're talking about, is his base, his Republican base, that public opinion numbers that we just gave you, has been remarkably consistent in staying behind President Trump. And so while his public support is somewhere along the lines of 35 to 40%, support among Republicans is anywhere between the upper 70s and the upper 80s. Right. And that hasn't moved no matter what he's done. As a consequence, what that suggests is, and this is why we asked that poll question, are you rethinking how you would support President Trump in 2020 based on what's going on in North Korea? What we've seen over the first 9 months of this administration is a remarkably robust base of support for President Trump, no matter what he does, for both his policy victories and when he's taken tons of heat politically at home. What he's doing, what he's saying, isn't changing that base of support. I suspect that to carry over with respect to North Korea. And so it really doesn't matter what he says on North Korea. I don't think the American public, or I shouldn't say, not the American public, but his Republican base isn't going to punish him for that. What that means is what he's doing on North Korea isn't going to change how people are voting in 2020 or even how they're voting in 2018. And without changing how people might vote in 2018 or 2020, he's got a trouble.
He doesn't pay any cost.
He doesn't pay any costs for making these threats. And as a consequence, in crisis diplomacy, this isn't providing new information about the credibility of, or the willingness of the United States to actually impose militarily a solution on the problem in North Korea.
I mean, how has the United States always handled the bellicose language from North Korea? prior to Donald Trump, we've ignored it. We've always thought that he says a lot of things, but he won't follow through because any step that would be taken that he's threatening would be catastrophic for him. His best, option is to avoid war. And that's one of the things that is still at the base of this conflict. Neither side benefits from a real military exchange here. And as long as that's in place and you've got a situation where Trump's political future is still unaffected by whatever he says about North Korea, then if the North Koreans are interpreting it that way, and that's the real risk here, then we're still at a status quo that's different from other crisis situations.
One other thing to point out here, and I think the scholar from Stanford raised this point, and it's important to remember, is that neither side wants a nuclear exchange here, right? The risk is when you have the escalation of a crisis is that it spills over into a military conflict inadvertently, that someone makes a mistake, some politician leaks something, says something they weren't otherwise supposed to do, a submarine commander off the coast of North Korea mistakenly reads the satellite or the radar and it looks like he's being attacked, and so he launches a missile attack against North Korea when there actually wasn't one, and then we get a reciprocal exchange of military attacks between the two sides. That's the risk here, is that an inadvertent crisis or an inadvertent military strike escalates into a larger war.
Because all the signals from each side is that neither side is going to preemptively attack the other. And so then the chances of a military exchange is basically rooted in this miscalculation. One thing to think about with Trump, and of course this is quite uncertain, is that his belligerent language does provide him certain opportunities, arguably, to change tact, just as Nixon opened up China, right? The harsh anti-communist can get away with it politically to make peace with a communist power, as President Nixon did with China. Perhaps President Trump could broker some sort of deal with North Korea, and he would have more credibility in terms of strength and not selling out to a foe like this than President Obama would.
And partly, and one final point on this, he would have more credibility, but he'd also be more likely to get a better deal. And this idea behind cultivating uncertainty, this is consistent with his larger business negotiating strategy. You cultivate uncertainty to pressure the other side to make more concessions to you. And this is one of the, we'll talk about this more when we discuss war later on in the semester. There's two games going on here. On the one hand, we're trying to avoid war, trying to avoid military conflict, but the US government is also trying to get a better deal with respect to North Korea, and that means getting it to disarm or give up its nuclear weapons. And so there's two sometimes contradictory challenges here. Want to prevent war, but also want to get North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons.
Right. All right, so we're going to move on now, and we're going to take a look at an ongoing humanitarian crisis in Southeast Asia in the country of Myanmar, and it was formerly known as Burma.